Hey everybody, Dr. Rasanalo here. How are you doing? Just a bit of update about how the course is going to run. So I just want you all to see where I'm coming from here with respect to course engagement. So I'll give you an example. If I go to gun control, which is the latest video, and I go to analytics, it tells me, certain things. In the last 28 days, which is, all of the days for this purposes of this class, because it's only been in existence for a couple weeks, you can see that it's got 11 views, which is fine because there's only 9 of you in the class. But the total watch time is 3.4 hours. And if all 9 of you were watching it completely, that would be up to about 9 hours. So that tells me something. And then if I go to engagement, let me come back to this guy. Right? If I go to unique viewers, 5 of you. So I'll count, I don't know if that counts me or not. I'm assuming it might if I watch it from somewhere else. But that means, 4 or 5 of you are not watching the video at all. So, that's a problem. As I mentioned, I'm not mad about it or anything like that. It's just a matter of, doing things that make it so that I have a functioning course, if that makes sense. And if I was teaching any class and only half of the students were showing up, that wouldn't really be a functioning course for obvious reasons, right? If it was a 50 student class and 5 people weren't engaging, maybe that would make sense. But this is not acceptable for what I think are straightforward reasons. Again, that's not to sound angry. I'm not angry. It's not to judge anybody who isn't engaging in the class. I'm aware of how higher education has, encouraged this sort of thing. It's something that I try to do my best to counteract as someone who takes their job of being an educator seriously, where I consider that more than just delivering a grade. I'm aware of how things have been about just the grade, and which encourages a kind of coasting along and getting the credits and getting the grades, right? And so I don't blame anybody for acting that way. It's how you've been conditioned to act throughout your educational career. I'm also aware that some people have other lives right now. It's the summer. It's got the summer vibes, whatever. Maybe you don't want to be sitting through this class. I get that too. I would just say that you might want to drop the class then, if you still have time, so that you don't get a bad grade as a result of that, right? And again, that's not meant to be harsh or anything like that. But yeah, I'm aware that people have lives that prevent them from engaging in this fully. So again, not judging anybody at all, just so you know. I don't take it personally at all. But I do need to do something, right, if I'm going to actually have a course. So what I decided to do is I would change the syllabus, and the revised syllabus is up. And I created a grading group called these lecture video proofs. It'll be 10% of your grade. The effect is somewhat desirable, at least, and this will be desirable for the ones who are going to lock this down, who this is easy. You're going to be happy about this because I took off 5% of the final exam. So it actually helps the people who are engaging in the class, because this is an easy 10% and it takes off 5% of your grade. And the other way of counting for the 5% is I made the reading analysis from 30 to 25. Okay, so if anything, I hope that it reassures the people who are doing the bare minimum of staying up on the videos, because this is meant to be easy. Okay, and then what you just need to do is you need to go to EC Learn, and you'll see on EC Learn that there is a prompt for submitting proof of the lecture notes. And you can do that in any number of different ways. You can take screenshots on your, or you can take pictures with your phone if it's on paper, and just show me the notes that you're taking along with the lecture videos, and prove to me that you're actually watching them. If that's an issue, if you're someone who has genuinely been watching the videos and that's an issue, let me know. Like, it's not, again, I just want to be clear, it's not at all meant to be burdensome for anybody who's been keeping up with the basics of the course. Okay? So if that's an issue for you for whatever reason, just reach out to me. I'm a pretty understanding person, and we'll figure something else out, right? And then, yeah, I mean, the quizzes are, the grades are somewhat of a concern. If you're watching the videos and taking good notes and you're not acing those quizzes, like, it might relate to how you are taking notes. I mean, what I would do is I would write this down word for word, okay, and then I would add more to it in a way that gives it examples, puts it in your own words and things like that. Remember, for the final, it's gonna be open notes, so it's meant to reward people who have been keeping up with the basics of the class, okay? But you're gonna have to explain this stuff, and that doesn't mean just regurgitating this stuff, because I give you that stuff in the videos. It means explaining it, right? And so what I would do, the way that I would go about that, is I would write this down, okay? If only so that you have a really clear basis for the quizzes. Because a lot of times what I'll do on the quizzes, as you know, is ask something that word for word is picked from the PowerPoint, so that those who are watching it will easily ace it. So I would write this down, but then I would write more for each of these bullet points, showing me that you understand what it's saying, or to yourself rather. Provide examples. They can be my examples that I give, right? So that you are prepared to explain the relevant material for the final exam, because the final exam is going to be an essay questions where you're going to have to explain something like this. So like one example of an essay question on the final exam might just be this, and then what you would have to do is, in an essay format, explain this PowerPoint very thoroughly. And so you want to be taking notes that do that now. And my point is that if you're doing that, writing this down, adding more, you should be able to just ace the quizzes, right? Some of you are, but some of you are not. And so for those who are not, like, I want to be helpful for you, and I want you to do well. So I'm happy to meet with anybody briefly to talk about what's going on a one-on-one basis, as I've said in the past with a few of you here and there. But everybody who wants to meet with me is more than welcome to, so that we get you squared away for these things. And it can also be an opportunity to talk about, how things are going in the class and where you are in the class in general, as a way of assessing that, which can be useful as things, because we're going to be winding down here pretty quick, right? Okay, so I hope all that's clear, and so just look out for those assignments, take good notes, and hopefully let's nail these quizzes, these last few quizzes, okay? All right, so with that, I can begin the actual content of the class. Again, all too recent of a moral issue, for a bunch of reasons that I'll talk about in the class, but just, or in the course of the lecture. But this whole idea of free speech, and what it means, you are sort of living through a misunderstanding of what free speech allows. I'm thinking about all of the misinformation that is spread lately by all the grifters on YouTube and whatnot, right? Misinformation and cable news, right? And other outlets where they make money off of misleading people, and they actually kill people, all the grifters out there, with respect to, think about all of the misinformation about the virus. Hate speech. I'm sure some of you in this class have been a victim of hate speech because it's so prevalent. Bullying, cyberbullying, things like that. The nice thing about the Ulrich Baer's piece is it talks in a very timely fashion about how speech is used to marginalize certain groups, like trans groups, for example. The amount of hate being spread towards trans people right now, it's astounding, and it's scary. Again, all too recent of a moral issue. The hate speech towards Asian Americans ever since the coronavirus, and how it was called the China virus and Kung Flu and all these other slurs, and what that has done to hate crimes towards Asian Americans over the past few years. This is well documented stuff. So speech is harmful, and the idea is that people need to understand what the First Amendment does and does not protect in order to get clear on, what the whole idea of having free speech is. And so that's what this unit is about. And I hope you'll find it relevant because, again, it relates to a whole bunch of issues that I hope to get into. So I thought I'd begin with some theory. Okay, I gave you, 2 weeks of theory with respect to, the sort of introductory ethical concepts. I hope I made the case for moral realism. I mean, a lot of you indicate to me that you understand why you can think about ethics logically. I mean, you've done that in every discussion forum post that you've given. You've stated your ethical view and you've backed it up with evidence and facts and logic. So you're sure behaving like moral realists, which is all I wanted to get clear. None of you are saying, I believe this, and then you're backing it up by talking about your feelings. Or if you do, you're not going to get a very good grade. But that hasn't happened. I've been impressed, frankly, by the reading analyses and the thoughts that folks are putting into those, and the discussion forum posts. I'm serious. It's been refreshing, and it's been neat to hear your thoughts. And so keep it up. And so but my reason why I'm saying that is that's all the theory that I've really given you, is just trying to get you to approach ethics in a kind of fact and logic-based way, and I hope you do that going forward. I hope it's one of the things you take from the class. The other thing I'd like to do is give you a kind of theory to back up this notion of why you should protect free speech. So we have a First Amendment right to free speech, but that just because it's in the Constitution doesn't mean it's something that you should do from a moral standpoint, right? It means you should do it from a legal standpoint, but none of you are foolish enough to say that just because something is legal that it automatically is moral, right? I mean, slavery was legal, for example. That didn't make it morally okay. And I tried to get you to realize the mindlessness of the defense of gun rights and a lack of gun control legislation, where all you point to is Second Amendment rights. Because the question is whether or not there should be anything in the Second Amendment that does that. So how does that apply here? Because there should be a First Amendment. Like, it's not only in our laws, but it's also backed by a kind of moral argument. And I thought I'd begin by giving you a couple of different moral arguments for why free speech ought to be promoted from a moral standpoint. Okay, so this is a moral ought here, just to be clear, right? Okay. Well, the first is, it's a view known as consequentialism, which, as it sounds, again, this is just a bit of theory, right? And you can go back in the textbook and read more about consequentialism. It talks often about utilitarianism, for example, which is the most prevalent form of consequentialism. As it sounds, though, it judges the morality of an action based on its consequences, very roughly speaking. So you can think of it like, why would beating me up be wrong, be immoral? Because of the consequence of beating me up, you would be causing me unnecessary pain. That's a consequence of the action. And the justification for why it's wrong to beat me up is because of the likely consequence that you'd be causing me unnecessary pain. Why would it be wrong for you to kill me? because of the consequence that you would be depriving me of all the future happiness that I would have while otherwise alive, right? After this lecture video, I'm going to go downstairs, I'm going to drink some beer, I'm going to eat some Cheetos, and I'm going to read some philosophy, and I'm going to play with my son, right? And that's what makes me happy, okay? Well, if you killed me, I wouldn't be able to do that. So that's why it's wrong, according to the consequentialists, is because of the consequences of killing me. So that's how they approach morality, generally speaking. So if I was going to protect free speech and argue for why you ought to protect free speech, I would point to the consequences of protecting it. Now we're looking at it from a policy standpoint here, right? Why would I promote free speech as a policy? And I've already talked about the different ways of approaching, moral questions from policy questions. Remember the moral question of whether or not abortion is or is not okay on a certain occasion versus the policy question. That's very different, right? Well, now we're examining the moral arguments for the policy question. And the moral argument for the policy question is it's better for society. That is the consequence of it. It improves society to have free speech. Why? It leads to free exchange of ideas. It exposes blind spots, helps us arrive at the truth, and things like that, right? This is, a famous argument by a utilitarian his name was John Stuart Mill, and he argued for a free speech as a policy because the idea would be, well, if we allow people to express themselves, then what will happen is that if there's something false or highly misguided going on, then if we allow somebody in the society to express themselves, through expressing themselves, they might expose the falsehood or the problem. And then the idea would be through the sort of exposure of that idea, society would be able to check itself and improve upon itself, right? It's very similar to the scientific enterprise, right? Science believes in allowing anybody to test its theories. And one person might test a theory and expose some anomaly in the scientific theory. Well, through the exposure of that anomaly, the theory improves. Well, the idea is through the exposure of problems in a society, say, for example, women's rights, to go back to that example, allowing people to express their views about women's rights, expose the problem of misogyny, and that hopefully will continue to reduce that issue and improve our society accordingly. So that's a very straightforward consequentialist argument for why you ought to promote free speech, right? Another bit of theory in a completely different approach, if you remember some of the terminology I gave you way back, meta-ethical questions and normative ethical questions. Well, these deontology and consequentialism are very, very different meta-ethical views. That means they have very, very different views about what it means to be good or what it means to be bad. For the consequentialists, what it means to be good is, roughly speaking, promoting desirable consequences, like happiness, for example. That's utilitarianism, which you may or may not have read about, and you can easily read about in the book. For a deontologist, the morality of an action is determined by whether it accords with duty, regardless of the consequences. Okay, so for deontology, the rightness or wrongness of something has nothing to do with the consequences at all, strange as that may sound, but it has to do with whether or not you've done something that is some duty that you possess regardless of those consequences. So you might, a good example, and I'm sort of in a class I beat around the bush with a long discussion about this, but in the interest of time, I'll cut to the chase. And one example of this might be keeping a promise, even if it was a pain in the ass to do so. Right, so my favorite example is your grandma, tells you when she dies she wants you to spread her ashes on the Appalachian Trail, and you're the only one that she told to do that. She dies, you have the urn in front of you. You realize that it would be a real pain in the ass to go out into the Appalachian Trail and spread them. So from a consequentialist standpoint, the argument is anyway, the consequences are such that the consequences would promote avoiding a pain in the ass and not spreading the ashes. You spread them, in your backyard or in a park or somewhere, or just keep the urn and don't tell anybody. right? And suppose no one's going to find out about it. Grandma's dead. She doesn't care, right? Okay, but the argument would be you still, despite what the consequences might suggest, you still have a duty to grant grandma her dying wish. And so what would be the source of that duty? Something like respect for her. And the idea would be the respect is reflected in the fact that you are keeping a promise that you made in the past. So if somebody said, why are you spreading her ashes even though it's a pain in the ass? You can say something like, because of what I did in the past. I told grandma I would do it. And if I didn't do that, I would be disrespecting her based upon what happened in the past. So I'm referring to what happened in the past to justify why I should do something, not the consequences. And so that's how deontology is different. So a lot of deontological views surround respecting people's autonomy. The idea would be you have a duty to respect grandma's autonomy regardless of the consequences. That means you have a duty to not let grandma be manipulated in any way. And if you told her you were going to do it and then say at the time didn't intend to do it, you'd be manipulating her. Okay, so there's a deontological reason why you should keep promises regardless of the consequences, and that is by doing so you would be respecting someone's autonomy regardless of the consequences. Just another example, what is your view on cheating on your partner? I'm assuming you think it's wrong, but what if you knew you could get away with it, right? I'm assuming you'd still think it was wrong. And so the idea would be, why is it wrong to engage in cheating even when you know you can get away with it? The consequences would say, hey, go right ahead. You're going to get away with it, and there's going to be pleasure involved. Why wouldn't you do it? You might say, because I promised I wouldn't do it, and out of respect for my partner, so I'm not manipulating them, I have a duty to respect their autonomy and not manipulate them, so that's why I shouldn't cheat. So, okay, so we can sort of equate, for the purposes of this lecture video, honoring a duty with respecting autonomy. Okay, where the idea would be you have a duty to respect autonomy regardless of the consequences. Okay, from that, I hope you can see why you'd have a strong duty to promote free speech, because all we are doing by letting people express themselves, right, through speech and other forms of expression, dress, things like that, all we are doing is giving them their full autonomy. If we restricted their speech, then we would be restricting their autonomy. We'd be manipulating them through fear or something like that, right? Okay, so there's a deontological argument for why you should respect free speech. Why? Because you have a duty to respect people's autonomy, and all you would be doing in respecting free speech is allowing an autonomous person to be autonomous. If you restricted their speech, you'd be restricting their autonomy and manipulating them accordingly, and that's just as bad as cheating on someone when you know you can get away with it, and not honoring grandma's dying wishes and so on, because all those cases involve restrictions of autonomy or manipulation of some form. Okay, so that's very quick and dirty theory as to why you should promote free speech at a policy level. You can think of it as a society that does this will flourish to the extent that it has people, a whole society who can behave autonomously. That's a deontological reason. Okay. So then the sort of thing to realize about that, though, is that that does not promote a kind of free speech absolutism. Baer talks about this in passing in certain cases. A so-called free speech absolutist is a very nonsensical position as a moral argument, anyway, right? Because as a moral argument, it's saying, if you're a free speech absolutist, that you can say anything you want no matter what it is, okay? There's the famous example, right? The fire in the theater example, right? I think I gave that in another video, right? It's perfectly consistent to say, I'm a proponent of free speech, even though I don't think people should be allowed to yell fire in a theater. Why? Because you're harming other people, restricting their autonomy. That's where I'm about to go anyway. Okay? So as soon as you set up, here's the thinking, right? As soon as you say, okay, I like free speech, what are some reasons, good reasons why I like free speech? Well, if you provide some, some consequentialist ones and some deontological ones, you are immediately confronted with the fact that you cannot therefore be a free speech absolutist. Instead, you're going to, whether you're a consequentialist or a deontologist, you're going to say you need to put constraints on free speech. Both of them are going to do it, though, for different reasons, right? One's going to have reasons that relate to consequences. The other one's going to have reasons that relate to respecting autonomy as a duty. Okay? But, it's just the fire in the theater idea here, right? Okay. Now, so you can't have speech that leads to causing harm, okay, in any way, shape, or form. And you can't, and this is where Baer's point comes in, you can't have speech that marginalizes or others or continues to oppress a certain group. I mean, this is, all too recent. I hope that you are watching the January 6th hearings. If you are not watching them, you should. And if nothing else, please do just watch the first day's testimony from last Friday, I believe it was. And just look up on YouTube or wherever the day one testimony. It's about 2 hours long. It's worth a watch. And the reason why I'm mentioning that is that's a perfect example of speech, namely the former president's tweets and everybody else who helped promote all of the lies surrounding the so-called stolen election. It's a perfect example of letting someone speak in a way that causes harm. Okay? I mean, 35%, because Trump, has just repeatedly just leaned into this idea that the election has been stolen, right? It has caused, I think, irreparable damage. I mean, unless you want to go like 50 years out from now, maybe then it'll be healed. Okay? But 35% of the country now believes it. I mean, why? Because he keeps saying it. I think that's part of it, right? I think people also want to believe it because they want to believe what they want to believe, right? Or they believe only what they want to believe, rather than what logic demands. 68% of Republicans, it was, I guess, as recently as April, according to this poll that I just looked at, 68% of Republicans believe that the election was quote-unquote stolen. Okay, it's verifiable fact. That's part of the reason why I want you to watch those hearings. It's verifiable facts. It's not like biased. They rely on testimony from people like Ivanka Trump and people in his inner circle, Bill Barr, his attorney general, people who are not, kiss-ass liberals, people who were involved and were Republicans. Okay, so it's not like a conspiracy theory. Verifiable information shows why this is wrong. Okay, and so the idea would be, on this view, people should not be allowed to do that sort of thing. They should not be allowed to spread that kind of thing and cause harm. Okay, those are examples of constraints. You should not be allowed to say something that leads immediately to someone's death. Okay. Another example of this, I think this is a little bit more tricky, right? Because it's, when you get into the issue of harm, what constitutes harm is something you need to figure out. I want to be clear, it has nothing to do with offense, like just being offended, right? You can be someone who believes in free speech and think it's okay to offend other people. I mean, if anything, offending other people can be useful and good for them because it can expose blind spots, to go back to that sort of point about the way that I said it with consequentialism, right? I mean, one of the ways that you will learn is by being offended and then being intellectually honest enough to look at yourself and figure out what that means. Because you will realize that maybe the reason why you're offended is because you have some sort of bias in place that this person in offending you is exposing. Okay? So merely offending someone, that should be protected under free speech. Right? But you get into sort of issues where, you can offend someone, for example, for trivial reasons, or you can offend someone because you say something like racist or sexist. Okay, now you're venturing into more clear territory of harm. Right? If you say something racist, right, that offends people, right, that pushes into areas of harm. I mean, the example that I think of is something I mentioned in passing at the outset. All of the racial slurs towards Asian Americans since the start of the pandemic and the virus coming in from China, the China virus, the Kung flu, and things like that. It's been documented. These are facts, that hate crimes towards Asian Americans have skyrocketed since that sort of speech has also become prevalent. Now, yes, it's a tricky scientific question whether that correlation involves causation, okay? But supposing it did, which I hope you agree is not implausible anyway, okay? Supposing it did, right, then should that kind of hate speech be curbed? One might argue that it could, because it leads to directly causing someone harm. I mean, the idea would be if promoting, racial slurs about the coronavirus, especially on a large platform like Twitter or something like that, that's going to have a huge influence over people. If that at least encourages people to engage in hate crimes and other, violence and hate speech and other things, right, towards, for example, Asian Americans, then that would be an example of causing harm. But you can kind of see where I'm going. That's not as overt, is it, as me saying with my speech, I want you to go kill that person, which is just sort of obvious, or fire in the theater, right? It's not as overtly harmful as those, but it sort of ventures into that territory. Okay. So you get into those tricky questions about what it means to cause harm, right? And that's a difficult policy question about what that means, let alone the question of how, after you've determined it to be harm, you want to address it. And that's something I'll talk about in passing at the end. Because this is just another one of those examples where we can all agree that all this stuff is a problem, but as far as the solutions go, that's really hard. Like, the solution is not to, censor everybody. That's sort of obvious. So then what do you do with all this speech that's such a huge and obvious problem right now? How do you address it? That's a difficult question. I don't think censorship is the answer. Okay. All right. So you can see that anyways, right? You can't, there's free speech absolutism does not make any sense on this view. Can't yell fire in the theater. You can't say something that leads to somebody's death. And maybe you can't engage in like things like racial slurs which promote hate crimes. That's a trickier question. All right. And, to connect it up with Baer, right, you can't say things, including, some of the speech that some of the students were protesting in the examples that he talked about, right, from, I think it was 2017, right? Seems so long ago, a happier time by comparison, which is crazy, right? But some of the protests were for people who overtly said things that marginalize certain groups. I mean, it talks about like Charles Murray. Charles Murray believes in the bell curve, where it was used as a sort of famous way of explaining why African Americans, for example, were were intellectually inferior, for example, because of their race, and he tried to find like biological reasons why. As you know, I hope that's all false. Look up Stephen Jay Gould, The Mismeasure of Man, who he debunked that long ago. But this guy, right? I mean, he's coming on campuses, right? And then the idea is, well, free speech should allow him to come on campus. Well, Baer's argument, I think it's an interesting argument, is, well, those kinds of people, if you allow that kind of speech and you allow people to spread that kind of hate, it serves to marginalize oppressed groups like African Americans, right? African American women, for example. All of the speech right now that is anti-trans and everything going on, which is just despicable if you do not know what's going on. I mean, I'll say a little bit more later about it. It's not good. It is not good the way that trans folks are being talked about right now. Okay, so somebody who is anti-trans, right? In giving them free speech, you marginalize that group. You make it so that they are not as free, right? You perpetuate things that keep them oppressed according to the laws of that society. You make it so that they do not have the ability to express themselves. Do you see? So I hope that that's why, if you believed in free speech, you can't allow something that oppresses another person, because that oppresses their free speech. Okay. So again, free speech absolutism, there's not much of a moral case that can be made for it. That's the idea. Remember, free speech absolutism is this idea that you can say whatever you want. Okay. So that's what's going on here, right? It's all just by way of getting at that. And you know, he talks about specific examples of and I thought they were interesting, right? Examples that invalidate the lived experience. That was that interesting sort of way that he framed it in the beginning, which I liked, which was the sort of new way of thinking about curbing speech in the name of making sure we validate lived experiences. So, I mean, you read it as well, right? The idea would be talking to a Holocaust denier, and you are someone who lived through the Holocaust, let's say, or knew somebody who lived through the Holocaust. If I was being a free speech absolutist, I might say, well, give me an argument, give me a logical reason why I should believe in the Holocaust. Prove to me beyond a shadow of a doubt that the Holocaust was real. You can't do that. You can't prove to somebody beyond a shadow of a doubt. You can show them pictures, but everybody knows pictures can be doctored. You can show them books and accounts and videos, but everybody knows all that can be made fake, right? People can give testimony, but they can be lying. So anybody who wants to live in a fantasy world like that, where the Holocaust isn't real, and they want logical proof, and they demand that kind of logic, right? They could say, well, I'm not going to believe it until you prove it to me. But you see what that does, right? That invalidates the lived experience. Somebody who says, well, I lived through that Holocaust, or I lived through, suffering with a relative who was a survivor of the Holocaust, or I had family members who I knew who died, and so on and so forth. And they had that experience and they lived through it, right? You can't prove something that you lived through, but that doesn't make it valid, like it didn't happen. I mean, do you remember what you had for breakfast? I'm sure you do, because you lived through it, right? But I want you to give me 100% logical proof of what you ate. I don't think you can do that anymore, right? Okay, so if I'm demanding that level of proof, that would invalidate your lived experience regarding what you had for breakfast. But I hope you see why that is that doesn't discount the validity of that lived experience. Okay. And now the point is, if you do that to people who are members of oppressed groups, right, then that just increases their marginalization. I think he was somewhat clear about that, but maybe that didn't get through. I imagine it sort of was obvious, right? So if you invalidate the lived experience of oppressed groups, you continue to marginalize them. And so anybody who promotes freedom should be against doing that. Hope that's clear. Okay. Now, let's just talk about an interesting issue that arises from this. And this is just something that, I saw. One of the reasons why I picked this article from Baer, it's like sometimes you read things and something goes along, you're like, aha, and you want to just pluck it out and focus on it and it alone. And, so this really jives with some of the things that I've been thinking about recently that I also hope are useful to you. And it's this stuff. It's the relationship between, believing in something like free speech and then thinking about the conditions that promote it, the conditions that make it possible, the conditions that detract from it, and so on and so forth, right? And so how do those relate? Well, anyone who believes in free speech would, I would hope, be interested in learning what are the conditions that make free speech possible. What are the conditions that promote free speech? And the idea would be, if you believe in free speech, you should be for enhancing or creating those conditions. So let's get into that a little bit more clearly. So, invalidating their experience, right? It's sort of a subtle way of harming them, right? You can on the face of it say, hey, I believe in free speech. I'm not doing anything wrong by talking in this anti-trans way, or using, hey, it's just the word kung flu. It's just the word China virus, right? These are just words. Don't be such a snowflake, right? And it's not sort of clear how that might harm an oppressed person or marginalize an oppressed group. It's not as overt or obvious as like the N-word or something like that, or the order to kill somebody, or a threat, or yelling fire in a theater. But it's very real. I hope you realize that. I hope the effect that that kind of speech has in marginalizing someone is very harmful. You just got to kind of look for it and be a little more subtle-minded, and not be so simple-minded and say, hey, it's just words. Okay? Pay attention to the actual facts, including the ones that might not be so obvious, and you'll notice the harm of that kind of speech. For example, the relationship between the rise in hate crimes towards Asian Americans and the use of those words. That's a fact that if you dug into it, we might find a subtle but clear form of causation there. Okay. Now, so there are, though, right, conditions that promote free speech and those that don't. That's the interesting thing about this, is the subtle kind of harm that's involved in invalidating their experience. It leads us to wrestling with this fact. What am I trying to say there? Because the idea would be, if I say, hey, I just want to have an open conversation about the Holocaust, all right, and I just want to approach it in a logical way. Well, if the sort of effect of invalidating a Holocaust survivor's experience, right, is to marginalize them, right, then they won't even, and he's good about this, and he cites, I forget the author, you can look it up, Leotard, right? He cites him, the professor at Yale that he mentioned, right, where the idea would be, the issue there is, if I say things that continue to marginalize someone and invalidate their experience, then they're not even able to sit at the table and have a free conversation, because they feel invalidated by that speech, and they are invalidated by that speech. They're not treated as equal. So we can't engage in a free exchange of ideas here if by you using those words you marginalize them and oppress them, and so they can't they feel like they can't be taken seriously, and they're not taken seriously in the society. They're oppressed in all sorts of ways, right? So the idea would be, the conditions that promote free speech would be whatever it was that reversed that imbalance and brought them up to here, so that they were no longer oppressed and marginalized. So you see how this issue gets in that. It's clear that the conditions for free speech are not met in the case of a media landscape, say, where the effect of anti-trans speech and anti-Asian speech and anti-gay speech and misogynist speech is to marginalize those groups. Then those conditions are not being promoted, because we're invalidating those experiences, keeping them down. They're not at the table, so to speak. Okay? So, and you can think about other examples of it as well. I mean, freedom of expression is an odd thing. I worry about this because again, you wouldn't know this based on this class and sitting through me yapping at you, but I like, a discussion-based class. And so, I often try to think about the conditions that create good discussion, right? I'm sure you've sat in classes where a professor says, oh, it's a discussion-based class, but the vibe in the class, the way that that professor, he or she carries themselves, the way that certain students in the class act, they promote the exact opposite. People feel uptight. They feel like if they're going to say something, somebody's going to judge them. Somebody's going to, cyberbully them. Somebody's going to record it on TikTok or whatever you guys are using, Snapchat, right? I have no idea, whatever it is, right? And then the idea is you're going to, make fun of them, cyberbully them. If you've been in a situation in the class or a setting where you feel like that, does that promote freedom of expression? No, you're down here, to use that analogy, right? You're not up here fully free and able to express yourself if you feel like if you say something, somebody's going to jump down your throat. Okay? So the conditions for freedom of expression are not being met if we create environments which make people feel uneasy about speaking their mind for fear of reprisal of some form, right? But now compare that to like when you're in your room with your friends, shooting the shit with them. I'm swearing a lot today. I don't know why. I swear a lot normally, but I'm usually better about it if it's recorded like this. But, right, if you're just, hanging out with your friends, you feel free in those conditions in that room, at a party, whatever, right? Those conditions are such that you feel like you can be yourself, so to speak, and you can speak freely and act freely, act goofily. No one's going to judge you, right? So now you're up here. You're not uptight down here by the context. You're up here, right? Okay, so then what I would ask all of the so-called free speech warriors out there who believe in free speech, you should be on guard for creating contexts where everybody feels like they have a seat at that table. And if you find yourself in situations where the conditions are such that they promote certain people feeling like they can't say anything without having somebody jump down their throat, right? Then you should be against those kinds of conditions, and you should be for creating conditions that promote the more dorm room setting where people can speak their mind and not feel like they're going to be judged, right? Okay. And I just want to be clear that if you are someone who doesn't want to do that, who doesn't want to create conditions that promote everybody actually being free to express themselves, then stop saying you believe in freedom of expression, because you don't. You like a BS version of freedom of expression where only certain people can say what they want, right? Probably the people in power, and everybody else has to shut up and go along with them. That's what you mean by free speech. Whereas if you actually mean something by free speech, you would be for promoting conditions which bring everybody up. Okay? So that's the idea, right? That's what I'm trying to get at here. You would be thinking about ways of engaging in discourse, right, that lower the stakes, so to speak. Because that's one way of framing that idea. Like if you're in the class with a professor who, you feel like you can't speak your mind, or uptight students around you who are going to, spread this, on social media and judge you and all that, then you feel, and regardless of whether this is true, that doesn't matter. You feel like the stakes are high. Like if I screw up, I'm going to get judged or made fun of or cyberbullied or whatever, or get a bad grade or whatever, right? So if you were someone who promoted free speech, you would be interested in lowering the stakes of that discourse, making it say, hey, you said something off the cuff, no big deal. No big deal, okay? As long as you're not actively causing somebody harm, right? As long as you're being respectful, then you should be able to say whatever you want, right? And you sort of lower the stakes of the discourse that way. That's what would be involved in doing this, right? Bringing everybody up rather than oppressing some groups and not others. But it's also the ways of engaging of it. I mean, do you think, like, I don't know if you guys are on it, but like Facebook comment sections, do you think those are good ways to engage in discourse, for example? Of course not. Freaking comments on Instagram posts, social media in general, like the whole presentation of a TikTok video. If I'm pissing you off a little bit, remember that's kind of the point. Right? I kind of hope I'm offending you a little bit. But like certain media, right? certain ways of communicating, right? They do not lend themselves to a kind of freely engaged discourse where people can speak their minds. If you say something and you think that you're going to get a whole bunch of hate on social media as a result of it, then you're going to be very, very careful about how you produce the video, how you produce your content. Okay? So there's something problematic about sharing information over those channels. Deeply problematic about it, because of all of the conditions involved and how they promote people not freely exchanging the ideas, but jumping down people's throats. So I mean, as far as solutions go, I don't know what that is. Is it something inherent to social media? I don't know. Is it something about the fact that people can comment anonymously? I think that has a lot to do with it. I mean, I'm sure there's one or two trolls in this class, I bet, just statistically speaking. Would you say that stuff to people's face? No, but you're a real badass when you're behind the keyboard and nobody can see you, right? Okay, so that's the point, right? The anonymity of the internet promotes people being mean, and that helps to bring people down and make people feel like they're not able to express themselves. So there's something about the media in general that we engage in to communicate these days, which is not at all conducive to free speech, at least in that way. And I don't know if that's inherent to the media or not. I leave that up to you. I think that relates to the solution to this problem, because we got to do something, okay? But the idea is thinking about that would be useful if you wanted to promote the conditions for speech. Okay. And that obviously relates to everything that Baer was talking about validating the experiences of trans people, as he mentions, Holocaust survivors, Asian Americans, African Americans, and so on, right? The idea would be, if you really were concerned about free speech and you weren't a hypocrite who just said they liked free speech only because they like to hear what they like to hear and they want everybody else to shut up, right? And they want to live in their social media echo chamber. If you're not one of those hypocrites, okay, and you actually believe in free speech in the way that I'm talking about, then that's going to promote that kind of inclusivity that he's talking about. And then that's going to justify the argument against bringing in people like Charles Murray, all right, and Ben Shapiro and all these other people who say things that actively marginalize people. All right. And then the last little bit is useful. I sort of already talked about this, right? I mean, among the conditions in question has to be something that curbs misinformation. I mean, this is as far as recent moral issues go. I know I began with this, but like, this is so recent and so important, and I hope that you are just aware of this. I know you are, but I don't know if you're aware of the gravity of it. Misinformation. You want to talk about like a pandemic, like a public health issue? Misinformation is the biggest public health issue beyond all comparison right now. The grifters are out in force right now. They're all over YouTube, for example, and cable and all this stuff, right? And they are spreading misinformation that is literally killing people. All of the misinformation about the coronavirus, for example. All of the misinformation about guns, okay, is as another example, right? Anything that you want to think, all the information about the so-called fraudulent election that led to January 6th, right? And led to 7 people dying. And if you think that's over, if you think January 6th was the end of it, you are wrong. It's just going to get worse unless we do something about this. If we continue to let people spread misinformation that undermines the very democracy that we live in, that is not going to be good, to say the least, okay? So misinformation is a huge problem, okay? And so the idea would be creating the conditions for free speech would involve doing something to curb misinformation. Now, we can all agree that that's a problem, but as far as like curbing it goes, how to solve it is another issue. I mean, I'll just give you a couple of examples. I don't think, banning Trump from Twitter was necessarily the right thing to do. Uh, I, my mental health was improved greatly after that happened, but that doesn't make it right. So that is one thing you could do. I'm not sure that's the best thing to do. Banning, deplatforming people, rather. Do you do that though? Is that the option? That's one option. Maybe it's not the best. Do you demonetize it? I mean, do you let the people who are now grifters say what they want to say, but they shouldn't be able to make millions. They make millions off of saying things that kill people. Okay, should maybe that do we just demonetize it? Is that what we do? Do we have some sort of regulatory body like the FCC? Do we give them some teeth? Right now, social media like Facebook is banned or is protected from lawsuits for like doing things like spreading misinformation about election, which they did in spades. You cannot sue Facebook or Twitter for spreading misinformation. That's nuts. So maybe we get rid of that. These are the solutions. These are possible solutions. I don't know what they are, but we have to do something. We do. We have to do something. It's a huge problem. Okay? And then, for Baer, what's that going to do, right? Is if you do all this stuff, if you promote all those conditions which lower the stakes, which improve the media that we use, the channels that we use for engaging in this kind of discourse, which deal with misinformation properly, which validate the experiences of historically marginalized groups. What he says is that's going to show up at the policy level, because you're going to, not allow people to say the horrible things that they do right now about trans people, for example. I know I keep bringing it up, but I mean, again, as far as recent moral issues goes, what's happening to trans people right now is disgusting. And you should, if you're not aware of it, I'm sure a lot of you are, you should be aware of it. And the idea is people can just say this because it's their opinion. No, not if you believe in the moral argument for free speech. That's what I'm trying to get you to realize, right? But all the speech that marginalizes women and African Americans and so on and so forth, right? The idea would be if you got rid of all of that stuff somehow, maybe got rid of is not the right word, but if you validated their experiences and promoted all those conditions, I leave it to you to figure out exactly how to do that in light of all the things I've raised, then people would just act that way naturally. They would internalize it, like, hey, you know what? Like, I have to validate the experiences of these oppressed groups, and it would just be sort of woven into our discourse naturally. I mean, I hope this is happening as, the old people die off, frankly. I know that's harsh, but a lot of the bigotry is increasingly and disproportionately older people, and younger people are much less bigoted. So I'm hoping, I don't think it's a sure thing, that as we just grow older and time passes and the bigots die off, frankly, that a lot of the younger people who are more accepting take over and we internalize these ways of speaking that are more inclusive. Well, do you think after that happens that the policies that we would have would improve? I think it would be obvious, because it would just be woven into our thought that you cannot have, for example, this trans bill in Ohio that's working through the legislature right now. That basically it's all about sports, evidently, which is, these people are really worried about, like, trans people who transition to a different gender. Say you're a male and you transition to a female, and then you want to play female sports. Well, they're really worried about the disadvantage that would pose to a female team that had someone like that, right, on their team, right? And we better not allow that, and so we better oppress those kinds of things. We better have laws in place that deal with that sort of thing. So, okay, what is the law on the books? Well, if there is a woman on a women's team who they suspect is someone who has transitioned to being a woman, right? then they will require, are you ready for this? Genital inspections. I'm not kidding. They will require genital inspections to prove that she is a biological female. That's freaking disgusting. That's working through the Ohio legislature right now. Can you imagine being someone who is a female and identifies as a female and was born female, but is more athletic, let's say, and has an athletic build, and they think they need to inspect your genitals to prove that about you? What would that do to you as a person? Think that would marginalize somebody? Yeah, it's disgusting. It's happening right now. Don't Say Gay bill. The Don't Say Gay bill in Florida. I mean, look it up if you don't know about it, right? It's the law that says you cannot teach kindergarten to third graders in a public school anything having to do with gender or sexual orientation, or anything that is deemed quote unquote inappropriate. And there's the vagueness in the law, because no one really knows exactly how it's going to apply. But when you have certain partisan judges, for example, who will interpret accordingly, right? Then you could have, a gay male teacher talk about their husband in their second grade class, and students ask them about their personal life, and they mention their husband, and they're a male in class, and then they get sued because they're saying something that relates to sexual orientation. So what do you think that would do to a gay man trying to teach in Florida, for example? All right, so that's on the books. That's passed. The Ohio one hasn't passed yet. Okay, so these are very, very real issues that this article is speaking towards, about how laws and policy is in place that is oppressing groups and marginalizing them further. We're taking many steps backwards as a country. And the point of this was to get you to realize why speech plays a big role in that. Okay, and then I hope that you decide whether you're for free speech or not. At least don't be a freaking hypocrite, please. Okay, because if you are for free speech, and you actually are, then you are for creating the conditions that promote it. Okay? And if you're not actually for creating the conditions that promote it, for lowering the stakes, improving the methods of discourse, not saying things that marginalize oppressed groups, if you're not for any of that, then stop freaking saying you're for free speech, because you're not. All right. I hope that's clear. Let me know if you have any questions about any of this stuff, and let's keep things rolling. And if you have any issues, like I said, with the lecture notes proof, just reach out to me. I'm not trying to be a pain in the ass for folks who are staying up on this stuff. Okay, take care.